today's show, we're going to be talking about women in the Bible, in particular Proverbs 31. And when I read it, I was very amazed. Women in the Bronze Age could actually buy land and they were self-employed. But we're also going to be talking about women in the Middle Ages, how some of them actually ran their own guilds. But we'll begin this video with David Gola reading from the scriptures, Proverbs 31.
This text was often, I think in my childhood, I heard it called the hymn to the good wife.
Yep.
And sometimes it's read even at marriage rituals. And that's through the image, really, of patriarchy, which, of course, isn't what the text is really about.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit odd. But let me just read a few of the verses of it. So it's Proverbs chapter 31, beginning with verse 10. I think I'll read through verse 16. A worthy woman who can find? Her price is far beyond rubies. The heart of her husband trusts her, and no prize does he lack. She repays him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks out wool and flax and performs with willing hands. She is like merchant ships. From afar she brings her bread. She gets up while it is still night and provides nourishment for her house and a portion for her young women. She sets her mind on a field and buys it. From the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. It's a beautiful hymn on in the wisdom literature. The wisdom literature is interesting because it often challenges and inverses what was fairly common in human culture. It shouldn't surprise us when we think of these issues of the relationships between women and men, that when we read the Gospels, they are like no other text in ancient literature for the relationship that Jesus Christ has with women. It's a profound shift in the way this is understood. And at the very center of it, seems to me, is that Jesus Christ is recognizing the fullness of the image of God in each woman that he meets. The Samaritan woman, the woman at the well, whether it's Mary and Martha, the woman who has the issue of blood, all of these images we have, including, of course, that extraordinary narrative about the woman accused. So, what's at work here? Well, the Gospels and Christianity, when it's actually functioning, is always countercultural. And it's countercultural precisely because it sees the fullness of the image of God in every human person. Women, men, the weak, the strong, the bright, the less bright. All human beings bear the image of God. And so all human beings share that dignity, which is absolutely fundamental. This got worked out in interesting ways in the early church. We even read about this in the life of Saint Anthony the Great. We usually think of him as the grandfather of the Desert Father movement, often thought of as the founder of monasticism. But if you read that text carefully, written by Athanasius, if you read it carefully, Anthony says in it that only when I found a house of religious women, this is after his parents had died, only when I found a house of religious women where my sister could be, was I able to go to the desert and work out my salvation. That has informed us of what was missed for generations, which is that women monastic communities existed before men's. They are the first monastic communities that existed. And it shouldn't surprise us, because Jesus Christ recognized the dignity of women in a full and complete way, as he did that of men in a full and complete way. And that, in the ancient world, was very radical. Because as you may know, at the time of Jesus Christ, in both Jewish law and Roman law, women were defined, given legal status, solely and only in connection with their father or their husband. If they didn't have a father or a husband, it is one of the cruelest things in human history. They were likely to end up as women of the night. It is a cruel and harsh matter. It's something that we see in our own day as well. So it's not surprising that if the early Christian women, witnessing what Jesus Christ said and how he was to them, that they would not find ways to live out their dignity with fullness, not simply live it out in relationship to husband or father. So they began to gather together and live together in communities. And then we have this rich tradition which extends from that time, certainly from the 2nd century on, where we have women's religious communities being central to the life of the church.
But he also said there was other other communities of women that weren't monastics, but that were living together. What was that called?
Well, we have there's a very nice literature on this. In the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, you had developed what's called the Beguines in Europe. Yeah, this is in the Roman Catholic part of Europe. And it was religious women. What had happened in the church, bishops get interested in all kinds of religious organizations and orders. So there's always been a bit of a tussle between bishops and monastic orders of men and monastic orders of women in the Roman Catholic Church, that there's a bit of tug of war. So you ended up in that period, a number of bishops in the Catholic Church were requiring the monastic orders of women to be cloistered, to live behind a grill in their own confine, but they couldn't go out and they couldn't be of service outside their monastic community. So we see this historically. There were times when they were required to be cloistered by their bishops, and other times when they weren't. That has had an influence here in Canada, because it was a number of those religious orders that came and settled Ville Saint-Marie, Quebec, the founding of Quebec. I often say that Quebec was founded by women. It was founded by these orders of religious women. And some of those orders came here precisely to get out from under the requirement of their local bishops to have cloisters, so they could live a more normal life in the world. But alongside that, when that occurred, you had lay women. That is, they did not, to my knowledge, they did not take the normal kind of vows that monastic women took, but they began to live together. And the model that they used was the model of the Holy Theotokos, Mary, going and seeing her relative Elizabeth. And that lovely narrative we have in the Gospels, where she goes, she's pregnant, and she goes to her relative Elizabeth, and it says in the Gospel that who was also pregnant with John the Baptist, it says in the Gospel that the two babes in the womb rose up and greeted each other. It's a beautiful image. So the central spiritual image that the Beguines adopted was that of the visitation. We call that event the visitation of Mary with Elizabeth. And what it means, women visiting women and giving them spiritual support in the demands of their life. So the Beguines shaped their life around that, around the visitation, spending their time visiting women within the village where they had their own little commune, and supporting other women, not just among their own people in the Beguines, but that became their base for doing that for the rest of the women in the community or in the town or city. It's a lovely, lovely form, and it's deeply rooted in the notion of a visitation.
But let's go back earlier in history. In the Middle Ages, we're talking about around the 15th century, women actually ran some of their own guilds. I mean, they could actually control the hours that they worked. They could control what they produced, the cost of the merchandise they produced.
Sure.
You know, some of them would make clothing, others would be bakers, but they really were controlling their own work. I mean, it sounds very leftist when I talk like this, but I'm actually quoting the Middle Ages. What really happened? I mean, like, was it the Protestant Reformation? Was it the Industrial Revolution? Like, how did women lose a lot of these rights? I mean, by medieval standards, that was the norm. I mean, they would control the means of production when it came to their work. You know, they ran their own guilds. This was the standards of the Middle Ages. And this is the context that I'm quoting, and this is the measurement that I use. How was that lost, and approximately when you think that was lost? Was it the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the history of women having the kind of authority and responsibility and control that you speak of. I mean, we see that at work throughout history in little microcosms. And we also see the somewhat larger picture of how that periodically gets destroyed. I'll just mention two historical incidents that play on this, because it takes a 3-volume work to describe the whole thing. And I'm not the writer of that. I can point you in that direction. I think a major first one was the Reformation, because one of the things that happened in the Reformation in the German countries and the Dutch countries, the lowlands, and then also it happened in the United Kingdom as well, is that Luther didn't, I think this was one of his unintended consequences of the Reformation. Luther speaks really well about family and what have you, but he closed down the monastic communities. And when you close down the monastic communities, you're closing down the women's monastic communities. That shrunk the possibilities for women dramatically, because in monasteries, women were abbots. It was their community. A woman abbot and a male abbot of a male monastery, they have in part the same dignity as a bishop in the Roman Catholic tradition. They don't go to the conclave and vote for bishops, of course, but outside of that, they have that kind of authority. And similarly in Orthodoxy, I've visited many women's monasteries in Romania and in Serbia. And I remember on several occasions when I was there with a friend of mine who's a monk and an archbishop, I remember how struck I was by the fact that when the abbess came out to greet us, my archbishop friend was the one that went on his knee and asked for her blessing. Because this is her house, her diocese, so to speak. And she's the one that has the authority here, not him. So that's part and parcel of what we see within our own tradition as well. When Luther shut down all the monasteries, and you may recall, he managed a local monastery. He managed to get all of his fellow monks that joined him in the new emerging tradition. He sort of married them off. He was a kind of a marriage broker. He married them off to the various nuns, and there was one left over at the end. And that's the one that he married. And she's a remarkable woman. She made Luther a much better human being, I'm sure, than he had been before that. So that meant that in substantial parts of Europe, women now no longer had their own communities and no longer were engaged in what women in monasteries do, which is doing there were women scholars in monasteries, doing various kinds of work of the church, doing various kinds of teaching and what have you. And you also have them, of course, caring for their the earthly needs of their community and providing for the needs of the poor. So that ends, and that ended up leading to a resurgence of patriarchy in Western Europe, and a resurgence of women, not always, but many more of them, really having to make their way as wives and mothers. The second and more recent historical incident that most historians talk about is how in the Second World War, because so many men went from Canada and the United States and England, France, into the war, you ended up having to have women enter the workplace to both take over the jobs that were vacant, to keep the society functioning, and also to do munitions work, making the things available for the war effort. So that meant that an awful lot of women went into the workplace in an industrial fashion, which was quite new. When the war ended and they all came back, there was official government policies now to turn that around. We had to have lots of propaganda to get you to work in the factories and make munitions. Now we have lots of propaganda to get you to go back home and have children and be a housewife. So if you look at the popular culture of the 50s and early television, Leave It to Beaver and things of that nature, that's all a kind of result of this effort to return to a state where men were the ones working outside the home, women were the ones working inside the home. But of course, you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, because we had the suffragette movement, we've had a whole bunch of other things. Women's movement was beginning to think about these things. There was an analysis of patriarchy and its problematic aspects. So that sent us down a different track in our society. But I would say the Second World War and the reaction to it, and then the reaction to the reaction, has really led us to the kind of situation we're in today.
Yeah, that's something to really think about. So I'm going to just present two things here. In World War II, actually it's amazing, women in the military, there was actually a female sniper that had like 300 plus kills. That was in World War II. But also, I'm going to put forth a difficult question for you, David. It's completely hypothetical, and perhaps it's very unfair to ask you about this. If the Protestant Reformation never happened, do you think all these major social upheavals wouldn't have happened if the Protestant Reformation for some reason never happened? Like I'm talking if we could rewrite history, or what we think would have happened if that never happened. But how would have history unfolded differently? Like would the communist movement take off in the 30s, 40s, and so forth, or actually more like 1920s as well, if the Protestant Reformation never happened?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting little intellectual exercise to think yourself back into a period where something as major as a tectonic shift, such as the Protestant Reformation, if that hadn't happened, what would our world look like? I think I would only say to this that if the Protestant Reformation hadn't happened, obviously all these things would have worked themselves out differently.
Yep.
But would they have worked themselves out? You better believe they would.
Mm-hmm.
Other things would have happened. And,
Okay.
and that would have led to a number of the things that we have going on associated with this theme.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say this about the theme. One of the real tragedies of patriarchy is men.
Mm-hmm.
One of the real tragedies of patriarchy is the kind of assumed burden that men take upon themselves and the attitudes then they develop towards women.
Mm-hmm.
This is a deep, deep problem.
Yeah.
And so I think this is not a smooth path. It's really an important one. And I hope that it will lead to increasing health for human beings in the world, for men and women.
I'm going to insert something here. Some people have said, they often question the leftist narrative of the patriarchy may not be the most accurate way of describing things. There's also the concept of male expendability. Young men in particular are deemed to be more expendable than women, hence we can have wars. I mean, to go to war, you must have a population that's deemed somewhat expendable. And since men, so typically in the past, did we actually live in patriarchy? Because men would die in droves on the battlefield. So, there's also the concept of male expendability.
I appreciate that. And I think you've identified it as being at the heart of patriarchy. And this is one bull getting rid of all the other bulls. There's this awful dimension of male pride and male lordship, which runs through patriarchal societies. So does the left have this analysis wrong? Well, I think the left, the right, all these ideologies only look at a little piece of it.
Agreed.
It's much bigger and much more complicated. And there's always things that in retrospect we can see as good, and there are things in retrospect we can see as problematic.
Very well said. Any final notes?
That's it.
All right. Take care, my friend.